We are here on the 15th of October at the Palestinian Solidarity protest in Amsterdam. I would like to say at the top of this video that although obviously we have a bias towards the Palestinian people and the pain of the Palestinian people, we do denounce all violence on all civilians, including the attacks of Hamas on innocent civilians. Any viewpoints that I do present in this video is not only for the cause of the Palestinians, but at the same time, definitely also for the cause of the Israeli people and civilians who are also caught up in the conflict, have to face forced conscriptions, including some of my personal friends and family friends. It is my point of view that there's only one peaceful way to resolve this issue, and any continuation of violence will also be detrimental to the Israeli people. Thank you. If you watch the largest and most official outlets of Western media, they will have you believe that this conflict started on October 7th, with Hamas breaking through the border that surrounds Gaza, entering Israel and committing unspeakable atrocities. However, there is actually a lot more history to this issue that is rarely examined by these same outlets, and I think it's important.
Currently, if you look at Western politics in general, but especially also the Netherlands, the media is incredibly showing only one side. We've seen Israeli flags being hanged, whereas over all the years of occupation, there was merely some condemnation of the actions of human rights violations, and those double standards are so incredibly wrong.
If you look at the television discussions and so on, and radio programs, it's overwhelmingly pro-Israel. And it's very difficult to bring an alternative view in the media. We are not invited to speak, and we are not approached to give our analysis of the situations. And this is already for a long time the case. And Holland is a special case in that respect. It's one of the most pro-Israeli countries in Europe. It will not lead to any better understanding of the situation. It will mean a next stage in the confrontation, perhaps within a few years elsewhere, perhaps, or again in Gaza, like it was before. So people should come to their senses and see that what is the cause and what is the effect, and not the other way around.
Really, this whole issue starts with the Zionist movement, a project meant to give a home to the Jewish people that felt that they were largely divided and displaced amongst Europe and the rest of the world. In 1917, this was made official with the Balfour Declaration that allowed the Zionist movement to take part of the mandate of Palestine, which at that time was under British rule. Obviously, during the Second World War, this movement became much more popular. There was a huge influx of migrants leading up to the war of 1948, which the Israelis deemed to be their war of independence, and the Palestinians called the Nakba, which is the Great Catastrophe in Arabic. This first major escalation of conflict between the two already shows most of the underlying problems that are causing all of this violence. First and foremost, as described by the British themselves, there were two people trying to rule over the same land. The Jewish immigrants that had just came versus the Palestinian natives that had been there for the last 2,000 years. After a war in 1948, Israel is made an independent state. They're recognized as such by most of the European governments. And the Palestinians that used to live on those lands have been displaced most of the times using violence. And here you already mark the first fundamental principle of the Israeli state, which is creating this idea of us versus them. And we cannot have what we want without kicking them out of their houses.
השתוללו בטנטור היה משהו נורא. טנטור היה כפר עשיר, בתים יפים, גרים כמו אירופאים, אתה יודע, וגם אנשים היו לבושות ויפה, וזה באמת היה כפר... אחד אנס שם איזה ילדה בת 16, משהו כזה. הוא לקח פשוט מאוד, ורצח אותם בתוך המכלאות. בתוך המכלאות, הם היו במכלאות, אתה יודע, חוטי ברזל כאלה, עגולים כאלה, אספו כל הגברים. הם יושבים שם, כולם, על הרצפה, ובא מישהו, ולוקח תת מקלע, ומתחיל זה, מחליף מחסנית. מה אתה חושב, זה והשתיקו את הדבר הזה, והיו חבר'ה שלקחו את הלוויורים ורדפו אחרי חבר'ה ושרפו אותם. זה היה משהו זוועתי, וזה אסור לספר, אני לא אדבר על זה, כי זה יכול להיות סקנדל שלם מהעניין הזה.
Eventually, the nightmare of the Nakba and the continued expansion of the Israeli project, the immense amount of provocations to the Arab people led to the Six-Day War in 1967. In 1967, you already see for the first time this narrative unfolding of Israel having the right to defend itself that is used until today. And this is a narrative that's very interesting because if you look at the 1967 war, there was a deliberate tactical decision made that the Arab countries should attack us first. And then from there, we'll be in a much stronger position militarily, but also politically. So what does that mean? When the Arab states then do attack Israel, they of course go to defend themselves. And at that point, they immediately use this defensive argument to conquer territory and to expand their country almost 2-3 times the size it was before the 1967 war. They take not only all of historic Palestine, but they also take the Sinai Peninsula of Egypt and the Golan Heights of Syria. So now all of a sudden, this country that is newly formed, that is constantly provoking when attacked, uses that excuse of defense to expand its influence and expand its domination over the Palestinians and the Arab people as a whole.
You know, we were all astonished that still on the level of politics in the Netherlands, they talk in terms of Israel has the right to defend itself. Israel occupies Palestine, not the other way around. Israel blockades Gaza, not the other way around. So it's so simple. Has an apartheid state, has a state that annihilates the Palestinian society, that state has it the right to defend itself? That's totally wrong.
You have this sort of state that is now legitimate but occupies territories illegally and is in a constant armed struggle against what is now called the PLO, which was the Palestinian Liberation Organization. This was an organization made up of several factions, but most of them were secular, non-religious socialists under the banner of Yasser Arafat, under the leadership of Yasser Arafat. The PLO resistance gains popularity amongst the globe, but eventually fighting Israel is seen to be a losing cause because they are not able to succeed, and the Israelis are not able to succeed in completely wiping them out either. The PLO, at some point, Yasser Arafat starts to take a turn towards peace. And in 1988, he decides to recognize the state of Israel. However, soon after, both the armed and peaceful struggle was seen to be as ineffective. And you have the first intifada, which comes in the early 90s, where the Palestinians essentially try to throw a peaceful revolution. And the first intifada is marked mostly by strikes and by protests. Eventually, that leads to the Oslo Accords. And in the Oslo Accords, the PLO decide to lay down their arms, to recognize the state of Israel, and to move towards a peace process where there are supposedly going to be these two states, one state for the Israelis and one state for the Palestinians. This accord, this deal that was met between the two sides, it was never a finished deal. It was only a first step towards more talks that would eventually progress into a peaceful resolution. That's why it's called a peace process and not just a peace offering. And this process never was allowed to take place, not by the Palestinians, but mainly by the Israelis. There were some factions of the Palestinians that continued armed resistance, but it was minor. It was really minor compared to the Israeli state, which was an official body that never complied with a single one of the laws and regulations that were agreed to in these Oslo Accords. The main issues being the expansion of settlements, so Israel continued taking land from the Palestinians. The issue of water, the Jordan River was divided between the Israelis and the Jordanians, leaving none for the Palestinians. And the water underneath the feet of the Palestinians themselves, their own groundwater, most of it was given to the Israeli settlers, while the Palestinians themselves could not even drink the water that they were standing on.
I'm originally from Scotland, but I live here now in Amsterdam. And I'm here because I want to end the occupation of Palestine. I want to see a solution to peace in Israel and Palestine. And I want to call on the EU leaders particularly to stop their blanket support on Israel and to actually stand up for the people of Gaza and the atrocities that are going on there. But I think also it's just that we need to also step away from seeing Israel as having no responsibility credibility in this at all. They're a hugely powerful government and a hugely powerful state. And it's up to them if they want to start a peace process and to continue it. It's up to them to make the first move on this. Yeah.
The UN at this point had passed a lot of resolutions trying to interfere, and every attempt that the UN made at providing some sort of progress, the Israeli government effectively shut it down. A lot of the UN projects at the time were focused on expanding Palestinian infrastructure. This is even seen in Gaza with the airport that was built by the EU. And all of these infrastructures sooner or later get torn down by the Israeli military, including something as simple as a water well that you would need for agriculture. One of the reasons why the Oslo Accords was a very unique moment in this history, where both sides were able to meet at a table, even though they were on opposing sides of the conflict, was because back then there was a global movement towards social democracy, one that had taken place in Israel, with the president being a social democrat, Yitzhak Rabin. The Palestinian leader, as I said, Yasser Arafat, was a leftist secular. And of course, Oslo had their infamous Social Democratic Party in power as well. And hence they were able to start a few peace talks. The failure of Israeli society being able to follow through on this peace process is marked very clearly by the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, who was the prime minister who started the peace talks. And the person who killed him was part of a extremist right-wing group that specifically said that they killed him because he was talking to the Palestinians and trying to start a peace process. At this point in history, the shooting of the Israeli prime minister marks a heavy right-wing shift in Israeli politics and society. Benjamin Netanyahu, the current prime minister, becomes prime minister soon after. And so when people say, where does Hamas come from? Well, this is the sort of environment it was born in. Palestinian people had now tried armed resistance, they had tried warfare, they had tried a peace process, they had tried recognizing Israel, they had tried legal avenues, and none of them gave any results. And when that happens in a society, it's obvious that the most extreme are the ones that are elevated and attract the most amount of people. Hamas obviously has its stronghold in the Gaza Strip, which I think only backs up that argument, because they were always the ones who saw the most amount of oppression. So in 1994, soon after the Oslo Accords, for example, a fence is put up around Gaza, and it's from that point on essentially blockaded, where Israel only Israel gets to control 100% of the movement of goods and people in and out of Gaza. And already back then, they start applying collective punishments whenever they feel like it, whenever they detect a threat or they trace back a threat back to Gaza. In 2006, Hamas has grown so much in popularity that during an election amongst the Palestinian people, they win the majority in Gaza, whereas the rest of Palestine vote in favor of Fatah, which was Yasser Arafat's faction within the larger PLO. Because of the staunch differences between Hamas and Fatah, there's a short civil war that breaks out within the Palestinians. A civil war which is now known to have been egged on and encouraged by the Israeli government, and a civil war within which the Israeli government actually decides to support Hamas. And why do they do that? Well, according to their own words, it's a strategic decision to divide and conquer, and also because, like the 1967 war, they recognize that the more aggressive, the more extreme they can make their enemy, the easier it is for them to go to war against that enemy. After Hamas takes over the Gaza Strip in 2006, Israel pulls out of there, and now you essentially have what is modern-day Israel and Palestine, which is a four-tiered system. So at the top of the tier, you have Israeli citizens. They have rights to everything. They have rights to water even within the West Bank. They have rights to, if they want, become settlers and go out and shoot Palestinians in the West Bank without any repercussions historically, and who can move within any part of Israel except for the Gaza Strip. Then you have Palestinians who are now Israeli citizens within Israel. The reason why they're another class is because they are categorized as such explicitly within Israeli law, that says that there's a difference between a Jewish citizen and a non-Jewish citizen. And one of the things that, for example, these Israeli citizens that are Palestinian don't have the access to is housing. There's a lot of mayors, a lot of communities that have put barriers in terms of how many percentage-wise, how many of the people living in these communities are allowed to be non-Jewish. And in general, they face a lot more harassment and discrimination than anyone else in the country. So essentially what you have there is a form of soft apartheid. The third class are Palestinians living in the West Bank. These are people who consistently lose land, consistently lose access to their own natural resources, and who are under a permanent military occupation. In fact, if you go to the West Bank today, what you will see is this sort of labyrinth of walls. You have one huge wall around Israel that completely blocks all Palestinians out from their ancestral homeland. And that wall is way beyond the 1967 borders and the borders of the Oslo Accords. And from this one big wall, you then see connection of smaller walls, which encapsulate settlements that the Israelis continue to build, leaving the Palestinian towns as sort of air bubbles within a larger Israeli colonial state. And in those few small gaps that you have left to be able to go see your grandmother, to be able to go visit Jordan, or move around in your own what's supposedly to be a state, you now have over 1,000 checkpoints that you have to go through all the time. The reason why it is apartheid is because there are such enormous differences in the rights and the quality of life between the Palestinians living in the West Bank and the Israeli settlers living in the same West Bank. So what you'll see, for example, is an Israeli settlement decides that they want to terrorize a certain village because they have dreams of expanding their settlement in that area. So they go in often with arms that are given to them by the Israeli government, and they start harassing the local population. They might even kill a few Palestinians. This is something that's very regular. And the reason they feel emboldened to do that is, one, because there's no repercussions, and two, because as soon as that starts happening, as soon as there's some form of unrest, the Israeli military comes not to de-escalate or hold them back, but rather to protect them and actually partake in the violence towards the Palestinian people. And now if the Palestinian people in resistance grow in numbers or all of a sudden a bigger threat, then you will see not only the Israeli military protecting the settlers, but the PLO as well. The Palestinian Authority will come in and they will actually stand between their own people, the Palestinian protesters, and the Israeli military. So you have now 3 lines of defense for the Israeli settlers who are on illegally occupied land, where the Palestinians can do nothing. They have their own police force aiming their guns at them. The 4th class then is the people in Gaza, who are not even allowed to enter the West Bank or Israel or anything. Half of the people in Gaza are under the age of 18, which means that a lot of these kids have never been able to leave the Gaza Strip, which is one of the most densely populated places on earth. And essentially what you have there is an open-air prison. Whenever there's a war or conflict, bombs start dropping from the sky. There's no access to food, water, or electricity. All of those are completely controlled by the Israelis deliberately. Any sort of UN or EU initiative, for example, as the airport mentioned, that is meant to improve upon the infrastructure of Gaza or rebuild after a war the infrastructure of Gaza to give water to the Gazans, are constantly delayed by Israelis. And then as soon as there's an outbreak of war, those are often one of the first targets hit by the Israeli military. At this point is when most of you probably start hearing about this issue, at least in our generation, where it's now become Hamas in Gaza versus the Israeli state. We completely ignore the issues of the West Bank that never stop. All of these things are continuing. And instead it becomes this sort of war between a terrorist group in Gaza versus the Israeli state, which is supposedly acting in self-defense. But is Hamas really the underlying core issue at hand? Are they really the main instigators of conflict, the main instigators of violence? In many forms, yes, of course. But we forget so quickly that any crime that we see Hamas commit has been committed time and time again by the Israeli government, a government that we support. So if you are able to be disgusted by Hamas, please use it as an eye-opener. There are way more civilian casualties on the Palestinian side than the Israelis. And they do it deliberately. Again, not only in Gaza, but in the West Bank. The targeting of innocent kids. Again, yes, a horrible atrocity committed by Hamas, but it is nothing strange to the Israeli government. Hostage taking, a big focus of the Western media at the moment, is one of the biggest activities of the Israeli government. Under military occupation, residents, kids are taken out of their homes at 3 in the morning without reason, without any form of trial, without any form of justice, under a military court, which is different from a civil court, where children are forced to sign documents in Hebrew without access to a lawyer, a guardian, or a parent.
Osama Arabi was just 14 when he was arrested for the first time. He was at a protest when soldiers grabbed him. That was 7 years ago. It feels like yesterday.
We were protesting at a fur prison gate. The army came and we escaped to the mountain. I ran for a long distance, but once they caught me, they beat me with their guns. They stepped hard on my back. When they arrested me, they kept beating me. Beating. Then they took me for interrogation.
He was taken to a military prison. There he was beaten again, verbally threatened, and refused access to a lawyer. Then he was strip-searched before being released without charge. It's not unusual here to see children dragged away by the army or police. A new report by the charity Save the Children says what is happening in the military judicial system is a serious human rights concern. It reveals 42% of the children arrested were injured. Injuries included gunshot wounds and broken bones. 65% were arrested during the night, mostly between midnight and dawn. 86% were beaten at some point. 76% threatened with physical harm, and 60% hit with sticks or guns.
And they're held there indefinitely without trial, without even accusation sometimes, just off an idea that this kid might have been problematic. They can take him and they hold him there, and they're being held there. They're being held hostage there. I would argue that the entire Gaza Strip is a group of hostages. 2.2 million hostages that are not allowed to go anywhere, that have no freedom. Within these prisons, there is mountains of evidence that shows how degrading and inhumane the treatment of prisoners, of Palestinian prisoners is. Has Hamas committed terrorism? Yes, of course. But if we are going to acknowledge that, please have the empathy to also acknowledge that what the settlers do in the West Bank is also terrorism. When the settlers go into a Palestinian village and throw violence upon them and start throwing bullets at them, the goal there is to terrorize the people so that they will move out. And as soon as they move out, we see it every day, again and again for the last 75 years. As soon as they move out, they take their homes.
Jacob, you know this is not your house.
Yes, but if I go, you don't go back. So what's the problem? Why are you yelling at me? I didn't do this. I didn't do this.
But
it's easy to yell at me, but I didn't do this.
You are stealing my house.
And if I don't steal it, someone else is going to steal it.
No one is allowed to steal it, ya ammi.
And what do we as Europeans do in the immediate aftermath of an upflare of violence over this occupation that's been 75 years and more? We have a vote on whether or not we should cut aid to Palestinians. We reiterate our unconditional support for the Israelis, reaffirming that their far right-wing movement is the only way towards peace that they should take, that self-defense, which is actually offense, is the only solution that they should pursue. And worst of all, our tax money goes on one hand to build projects of infrastructure and well-being for the Palestinians, and on the other hand, to the same bombs and weapons that destroy those projects, and we refuse to do anything about it. Ukraine, it seems perfectly easy to talk about war crimes and independence and the right to resist.
Targeted attacks on civilian infrastructure with a clear aim to cut off men, women, children of water, electricity and heating. With the winter coming, these are acts of pure terror, and we have to call it as such. This is a moment to stay the course, and we will back Ukraine for as long as it takes.
אנחנו מטילים מצור מוחלט על העיר עזה. אין חשמל, אין מזון, אין מים, אין דלק. הכל סגור. אנחנו נלחמים בחיות אדם, ואנחנו נוהגים בהתאם.
In the face of this unspeakable tragedy, there's only one possible response. Europe stands with Israel. And Israel has the right to defend itself. In fact, it has the duty to defend its people.
If you are able to stand up against the oppression of Russia, the state of Russia against the Ukrainian people, then you must come to recognize the same evil unfolding in Israel. Israel has killed more children in 1 week than Russia did in 18 months of war against Ukraine. And that's a misleading fact, actually, because it's not just more children, it's almost double. And by the time this video is released, it most definitely will have gone more than double. Somehow we refuse to take it seriously. Why can we not value those lives that are being at risk because of these war crimes as much as we value the lives of the Ukrainians?
Yeah, I've gotten harassed as well, wearing my keffiyeh, wearing like my Free Palestine.
Here in Amsterdam?
Yes, exactly, yeah.
In school, you're saying?
Yeah, I go to school in Wassenaar, and so wearing this is dangerous. I was reported by my peer mates for wearing this, like by my...
And what was the report of?
Of me wearing this, people were thinking that I was going to hurt them.
But you have received explicit communication around not wearing Palestinian flags in school?
Yes, yes. I've gotten spat on, I've gotten pushed, like I've gotten like shouted at. A lady came up to me and told me to take my pin off, like this pin. Well, I feel like it's my right to wear whatever I want, as long as I'm not doing harm to anyone. Vice versa, like, okay, an Israeli wants to wear an Israeli flag, like who am I to say no?
Last week in Groningen, in the north, a Palestinian young woman was protesting with several others on the central square in Groningen, and they were attacked by Jewish Israelis. They were Israelis, they had the Israeli nationality. And we know this because they were caught by the police and they had to show their papers, and they came from... And they attacked a man. The young lady got a punch on her head and had
an injury, a black eye, or...
Yeah.
In fact, our response goes beyond a complete indifference for the lack of human rights of the Palestinians to actually restricting the civil liberties of European citizens. People in France, Germany, and the UK have been restricted and not allowed to protest, to have their voices heard. And we want the world to follow a rule-based order based on that, when we don't even allow our own citizens the freedom to speak up for the freedoms of other people around the world.
I just saw somebody getting fined 135 euros in France for waving the Palestinian flag. When did waving a flag of a country become illegal? And I think it's a very scary step if governments are going to allow this to happen. In the UK is a particular example where protests have become extremely banned, and protest is a point of democracy, and we need to be standing up for the right of every citizen to do this, and also to be able to stand with other people in other countries. So, yeah.
But for example, if you compare it to Germany, where it's now illegal to have that while there's a genocide on Gaza going on, I think we should really start thinking on what's happening and why the governments in the West respond the way they do.
Thank you very much. Is there anything else you want to say before we end the interview?
Free Palestine.
You cannot have an Israeli society that continues to be this alt-right and fascist, because it's not good for the Israelis themselves. It never has been. In fact, that was one of the main leading principles that led to the Oslo Accords. The idea that the prime minister had, that he was scared of militarizing his own people and what that would do to them. A life of occupation is terrible for the occupier and the occupied, because you're constantly living in this world of fear in systems of violence. Having to live with the fear that this could at any moment explode into a massacre like we saw on October 7th is also it's not sustainable. And like any right-wing extremist government, like any fascist government, the hatred eventually is always reaccumulated and faced inward, because you cannot have a fascist government without a scapegoat. And right now, leading up to this escalation of war, actually all of the European coverage on this issue was about Israeli internal political problems and them slowly edging towards a dictatorship. That is fundamentally tied to their existence as an apartheid military occupation state. One of the worst aspects of Israeli life is forced military conscription, where 2 years of your life right after high school, you have to go and serve the military, and you're sent to protect Israeli settlers. And what does that do to your mind when you're forced to shoot somebody who's innocent? It forces you to become an accomplice in this terrible regime. And if the way you solved your disagreements with the natives was through war and genocide, then the way you will solve internal disagreements will also be through armed conflict. And what sort of future Jewish state of safe haven, of refuge is that?
Well, the other side of the sign is this, which is the promised land can't be built with genocide.
And now the Israeli government is trying to equate Hamas to the Nazi movement. The Nazis are in Saxony, not Gaza. They're in Zurich, Lombardia, Limburg. The Unite the Right rally was in Charlottesville. What is the long-term hope and idea for the Jewish people if the Israeli state, which according to them is supposed to represent all Jewish people, is so closely allied with the most alt-right factions of the Western world? Having gone through all of this history, what is the solution then? The only way to change the outcome is to change the equation. The equation right now is set up so that as a Palestinian person, whether you choose violence or peace, the result is the same for you. Ethnic cleansing, displacement, no human rights, no freedom, and in many cases death. If I choose violence, I will be killed. If I choose peace, I will be killed. Through the apartheid system, Israel is on the other side of that equation. Because of the support of Europe and the US, they're on the other side of that equation, where if they choose war, actually they have peace. I mean, they hide behind a facade of civility. So if they choose violence, they still live peaceful and untouched lives, comfortable lives. But if they choose peace, again, same result. So they have no incentive to change. Both sides no longer have any incentive to choose peace. There is just the side that chooses violence to gain more, and the side that chooses violence to stop losing. So what can you do? Well, the easiest one is to offer a peace process to the Palestinians that actually gives results. Why don't we turn on the water to Gaza as a first step? Why don't we reach an immediate ceasefire with Gaza and say, hey, if we stop shooting each other for 24 hours, we'll let in all the aid in the world that you want. And in those 24 hours, then you say, hey, if we stop shooting at each other for 1 month, we'll build another desalination plant so that more people can have water consistently. What if we say that if we have peace for the next 10 years and we don't shoot at each other, we will retract our settlements, we will allow free trade, we will allow you to move around the world, and we will slowly but surely build a Palestinian state. The more we give them their basic human rights, the more we give them a space for aspiration and dreams, even the idea that you might one day see something else than these walls and what's in between them, and the bombs that drop from the skies, the more we do that, the less likely we make it for the Palestinians to choose violence. And likewise for the Israelis, by the way. I think it's beautiful that Europe and America has been able to build and fund a healthcare system in Israel that is public and free to all Israeli citizens. I think that's beautiful. But why can't we do it for the Palestinians too? That's one side of the equation. The other side of the equation, which is very relevant for us Europeans and Americans, is to put pressure on Israel, just like we did apartheid South Africa. Say, hey, if you choose violence, if you don't stop, we will sanction you. Your economy will suffer. We will not go and visit you as tourists. You will lose political support because now the world is turning against you, and that will have an impact on the people in Israel. They won't vote for you. So as a European citizen, as a citizen of this world, I call not only on my government, but on my fellow citizens to rise up with me in protest against our governments so that that equation can be changed. Boycott, divest, sanction. It worked for South Africa, and it should work here too. Sanctions did not work on Russia, but that is because they are our enemy. They were already counting on us doing sanctions. When it is your ally that you sanction, it is much, much more powerful. And only through that will things change.
I think one of the hardest things to come to grips with is that the people who always scream the loudest about the Holocaust and say never again, and we have to learn the lessons of history, particularly American and European leaders, are the ones who are most actively supporting this Holocaust in Gaza. A genocide in Gaza. They're sending airplanes full of bombs to drop on Palestinian babies. The ones who build museums to the Holocaust and say, we need to take Palestinians and Arabs to these Holocaust museums to educate these savages and barbarians, jungle people, as Joseph Borrell, the EU foreign policy chief, called them. The White House spokesperson, Karine Jean-Pierre, said that calls for a ceasefire for Gaza are repugnant. What kind of world do we live in where calling for a ceasefire is repugnant? These people worship war. They worship death. I'm 51 years old, and I wake up every day as angry and as enraged and as outraged as I have been my whole life at what they're doing to us. But you know, Rifat, they want us to be nice victims. Yeah. They want us to be polite. They don't like it when we're angry. I get messages saying, oh, you know, you should present yourselves better. You won't win support if you're angry. What support did we win for all these years? All these years of advocacy, of meetings, of lectures, of speeches, of meeting with politicians. Not one European politician objected to cutting food and water and electricity from children. Not one Arab country of those regimes run by traitors withdrew their ambassadors from Israel or closed their embassies with Israel. What is this? What is this hell we're living in? Our hearts are in pain, our hearts are broken when we see this world that allows the scenery that we're seeing in Gaza today. Massacre after massacre after massacre of whole families, of 583 children as of this morning. By the time we finish this live stream, the number will have gone up. And people digging in rubble in their bare hands. And this is a world that lectures us about human rights and democracy. I don't know what to say to you, Rifat. I don't know, as you have said, as Khalil said, he doesn't know how to face his children. I don't know how to face you and to face people in Gaza. And I don't know how to say to you that I'm sorry we failed.